Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us on the second of 6 webinars that we will be featuring here throughout the year at the National Museum of the Pacific War, paying tribute to the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. I'm Jeff Copsetta. Today I'm joined by Dennis Blocker, and today we're going to talk about the prelude to the Battle of Iwo Jima. And Dennis, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think when people think of the prelude to the battle, those opening stanzas, we picture those Marines heading to the beach, wave after wave, but really, the battle started 2 days before the Marines hit on the 17th of February, 1945, with 12 of these landing craft infantry gunboats, these kind of specialized boats deploying underwater demolition teams pre-invasion. So Dennis, he's a Pacific War historian. He has a very unique, very compelling connection, family connection with this prelude to the Battle of Iwo Jima. So again, Dennis, thanks for joining us and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. My story for my family story into Iwo Jima actually started on August 11th, 1999, and that began with my grandparents. Of all people, that was my grandfather on that day took his life. He committed suicide, and Grandma had died the year before, and when he just couldn't deal with it. And I remember the day was a very long day because I had the information before my parents. And I knew that it was going to be really rough on Mom because she had lost her mother in less than a year before. And when we told Mom, then it was everything you could imagine. And I recall my mother sitting at the table one day, and she was crying, and I walked up behind her and I was massaging her shoulders. And I said to Mom, it's going to be okay. We're going to get through this. She spun around, looked at me, and said, "I want you to find out what happened to Daddy during the war." Startled me, and I wasn't expecting that. And I says, "Why?" She says, "I have to know why when I was a kid, all growing up, we would hear my dad cry out in the middle of the night." She says, "I think something terrible happened to him." So, that started me on my journey. But then the question is, where do you start?
He didn't really talk much about this when he was alive.
No, just like most of the guys from that time period who saw a lot of action, they didn't talk. The one clue that we had was that there was a Navy picture on the wall of him in uniform. And with that Navy picture, we could see that obviously he was in the Navy. But then again, my question was he in the Atlantic? Was he in the Pacific? Was he stateside the whole time? I had no clue. So that was the key question, was find out, where was he? Where did he serve? So my biggest clue came because, fortunately, when I was a teenager, I had this hobby where I would collect World War II veteran autographs. And I would look in the paper here in San Antonio, and I would see that, the Doolittle Raiders were coming into town, or the World War II Fighter Pilot Aces Association was going to be there. And I got to meet Tex Hill and got to meet Chuck Yeager and these other guys. And it just so happened that one day there was a advertisement in the newspaper that, LCI Association was coming into town. Now that was important to me because that second clue came, and that was the fact that I had, of all the autographs I had to get of World War II veterans, there was one very in particular that was very important to me, and that would have been my grandfather. So my mother reminded me of that. And she said that, "Hey, didn't Grandpa sign a book?" And I was like, "Oh, yes." Because remember, I was trying to find out, okay, he was in the Navy, but hopefully we could find out what ship. So the only lead I could have was, hopefully he put in the book, what ship he was on. So I went to the book. It was by the Associated Press. It was called Victory Over Japan. And sure enough, he signed it, Cliff Lemke, LCI-449, 43 to 45. So, when I saw that,
That's a good clue.
That's an excellent clue. Yeah, excellent clue. And the LCI, I figured, LCI probably stood for Landing Craft Infantry. And I was correct. But what I was thinking turned out to be an LCVP. Everybody should be familiar with. There's a famous photograph where the LCVP is hitting the beach on Normandy. when the ramp comes down. That's what I initially thought an LCI was. It turns out, it wasn't. But actually an LCI, through my research, turned out to be a lot bigger. And and you can see the photograph of my mom there. And we can go to the next one, and you can see this next picture is my grandfather and me. I just love that look on his face, and that's my mom's favorite picture of us together, with the pride in his face looking up at me, and you can see the pride on my face. And this is that picture, that famous picture from Normandy with the LCVP. This is what I thought an LCI was.
Yeah, LCVP, of course, standing for landing craft for vehicles or personnel.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes, sir. So, but this right here, you see the schematic for an LCI. It was about 150 feet long, 23 feet wide, capacity of about 200 soldiers they would have, or Marines. And there was a ramp that would come down on the forward part of the ship on each side of the bow. And they would beach themselves on purpose. But before they beach, they'd drop an anchor so they could winch themselves off. They would be lighter with all the men off. And they'd ram themselves up on the beach, and those ramps would come down, and the troops would assault. And that's, what the ship my grandfather was on. So when I saw the advertisement in the newspaper for the LCI Association coming into San Antonio, you can imagine my excitement. So I packed up my autograph book. I went down to the River Center Mall, parked at the parking garage, and was walking around by the Manger Hotel where Teddy Roosevelt signed up the Rough Riders. And as I was walking around, I was seeing all of these gentlemen walking around with blue caps that said LCI Association. And it was like I was in heaven because
this is some of them here.
This is some of the fellas here, many of whom I would later become very good friends with. And they were walking around, and of course I'm stopping everybody. Were you on the 449? No, son, I was on the 713, or I was on the 979 or the 1091. The numbers were alarming, because then I thought, if there's that many LCIs, what are my chances of finding somebody from the 449? Yeah. But it just so happens that I was down by the Riverwalk, walking around, and I seen two gentlemen getting up from their table, and on their hats were the LCI logo. And I approached them. I could tell they were done, so I wouldn't be rude to approach them. And they were digging in their pockets, getting their wallets out to pay the tab. And I says, my grandfather was on an LCI. And they says, oh yeah, which one? I says, the 449. And they froze. Like, I can still see that image. The fellas turned out to be Bill Brinkley and David Cox. And they said, 449, what was your grandpa at Iwo Jima? I said, yes. And their next question to me would set the tone for what would turn out to be the next 14 years of research.
Wow.
They asked, did he survive? And I said, yes. Why? And they says, your grandfather's LCI was at Iwo Jima on a recon mission 2 days before the invasion with underwater demolition team frogmen. The ship was hit 3 times by mortars. 60% of the crew of 70 was either killed or wounded, and the skipper of that LCI received the Medal of Honor, Rufus Herring, and it would prove to be the first Medal of Honor for Iwo Jima. Did you know any of that? And I was just stunned. Yeah. He said, in about a week, we're going to be back home. I'm going to send you a roster of the guys in our association that were on that ship. So you can imagine. I mean, I just immediately called Mom and says, we have a huge, huge lead. So she was very excited. True to his word, Bill Brinkley. A week later, I got a package from Bill Brinkley. And it was a roster of guys that had actually been on the ship at Iwo Jima. It was 70 guys. So it was about 70 guys. So now, including officers, that's my mission. I've got to find these 70. And I had charts on the walls, I had cards made up, and I started just trying to track down these guys, emailing, I am sending letters, snail mail, I am making hundreds of phone calls. Were you with my grandfather? This and that, and a lot of dead ends, a lot of dead ends, of course. But I started finding guys. And one of the guys that I got was Charles Hightower, who you may see a photograph of me sitting in his barber chair He was a barber for 50 years. What was surreal about meeting Charles is that I got to meet him several times and went to his home in Russellville, Arkansas. And I remember when he invited me, I was going to stay at a hotel, but he invited me to stay with he and his wife. And I remember sitting in the guest room, and I was laying in the bed, and I was looking at the window, and I couldn't believe where I was at. You know, I couldn't believe that because there's a photo that I have in our family's collection of my grandfather with some of the survivors of the Iwo mission in front of the shrapnel-riddled conning tower with a tarp over the side because of the huge hole in the side of the ship. But there's a picture that I have with my grandfather kneeling right beside Charles Hightower.
Oh my goodness.
And they're side by side, brushing shoulders. And here I am in that photograph, brushing shoulders with Charles Hightower. And I remember Hightower came in, and I was getting ready for bed, and he says, "I want to show you something." We went over to the dresser and pulled out this Japanese battle flag, and he unfurled it. And he told how when they were at Saipan that there was an air battle overhead, and a Japanese pilot was shot down, and his parachute descended, and his parachute deployed, and he was coming down. And they vividly could see him, and they knew they were doing the trajectory. They're like, he's going to land right here. So the skipper yelled out, "You guys go below, break open the armory. We need to get some weapons. We're going to get a prisoner, it looks like." But as the guy is getting closer and closer and closer, they could see the Japanese pilot looking around, and all he sees are American ships, right? Well, they had been told that their propaganda that, you know, the American fleet had been sunk. So the fellows see him. He's kind of maneuvering in his seat, and he in his straps, and he pulls out, and he's doing this motion above his head, and he's cutting the lanyards of his parachute with his knife, and the parachute collapses, and he falls hundreds of feet and hits the water, which at that distance was as rock solid. And he died, and they fished his body up with a boat hook to try and get some intel or information. So one of the fellows got his watch, another fellow got a ring, and Charles Hightower got his flag.
Wow.
And that was incredible for me. Another really interesting thing for me was Raphael Johnson was a steward's mate. And in the Navy, that it's a rating that's not even around anymore because it's so horrible. I mean, really, the steward's mate basically was a butler to the officers.
This is him here?
This is Raphael Johnson. Raphael Johnson was from Decatur, Texas, and I knew that if I was going to find anything on him, I needed to go there. So I drove up to Decatur, Texas, and I went to the deeds office, and I found where his father, Roosevelt, had purchased a couple lots, and I went there trying to find, and they had moved out. The homes had been bulldozed down, and now it's a trailer park and some storage sheds. And I was kind of disheartened. And as I was leaving, I look off to the right, and I saw a lady bringing in groceries into her house. And she was an African-American lady, and she was older. And I thought, why not? So I pull off, and I walked up to her house. By this time, the door was closed, and I knocked on the door. Now, I knew I had one shot. All right? I looked like a bill collector. And I was like, oh, my gosh, I look suspicious. What am I doing there? And I thought, I think I know how I'm going to get in. So she opened the door, and I had that picture right there, and of Raphael Johnson. And I held it up, and I says, "Ma'am, do you know who this is?" And I'll never get goosebumps. She said, "Oh my God, that's RL, Raphael L. Johnson. That's RL."
Wow.
She says, "Get in here." So I went into her house, and she allowed me to set up a tripod and a little digital recorder. And we talked about RL, about him growing up in Decatur and what it was like, how that the school he went to was an all African-American school, and the books that they would get were hand-me-downs from the white school, and that they wouldn't even be trucked over. They had to walk. The boys from the school had to walk a couple miles to go get the books and then heft these heavy books all the way back. She told how RL was a tremendous second baseman on a local African-American baseball team called the Decatur Cats, and how that he had aspirations of going pro, later on. How he was a tremendous dancer, a tremendous shot, which would play heavily into his story. later on aboard the LCI-449. But it was something that I'll never forget. And we got in a car together, and she drove me around Decatur, and she showed me the majestic theater where they would have to climb hand over hand on a ladder outside the establishment, because the Africans or Americans were not allowed to sit at the bottom, so they had to go outside and sit in a balcony. These are the things that Raphael had to face, and that molded him into the man he was. And I think when people possibly delve into the heart of hell, they will really see what a great man he was. In spite of everything that had happened to him, he wanted to serve. I'll never forget Bruce Hallett. When I called Bruce Hallett on the phone, and when he answered, he says, "Hello." I says, "Yes, I'd like to speak to Mr. Hallett." He says, "This is he." I said, "Sir, I was wondering if you were with my grandfather at Iwo Jima on the LCI-449. And Bruce Hallett, there should be a picture coming up. Here's Bruce Hallett here, great picture, looks like a Hollywood star. Bruce Hallett says, "Yes, I was on the 449 at Iwo Jima." And he says, "Just a minute." And I could hear the metallic, almost metallic clack as the phone went down on the tile of what I assumed was maybe a kitchen counter. And the next sound was him vomiting into the sink.
Oh my goodness.
I said LCI-449, and it brought up all of that, and he just immediately started vomiting into the sink. Of course, now I feel like a heel, for doing this to this poor guy. And his wife Phyllis got on the phone and says, "Bruce wants you to call back tomorrow." I was like, "Are you kidding? I'm so sorry. I'm never calling again. I am so sorry." She says, "No, I haven't seen him this happy in a long time. He wants you to call tomorrow." Wow. And I did, and we started a friendship that lasted over a decade, as long as he lived. And I got to meet him on several occasions, and got to walk the deck of the restored LCI 713 up in Portland. And he walked me through what happened at Iwo Jima. It's a moment I'll never forget. Absolutely. But everything didn't go, everything wasn't always smooth. I had to get creative on some of the ways that I would interview these guys. One guy in particular was a particular challenge, Junior Hollowell from Fort Worth area. Junior Hollowell, when I called him, this is how he answered the phone. "Hello!" And it startled me because he yelled right into my ear, "Hello!" And I says, "Yes, sir, my name is," and he just slammed that phone down. And I says, "Oh my gosh, these guys have always been so kind and welcoming, And so I says, "All right, let me try it again." So I called him back. "What do you want?" "Yes, sir, my name is Dennis." Boom, he slams it down. And I was going to give up. My mom, what was funny was my parents were listening to this. I put it on speakerphone because they were like, "Wow, these must be really nice, these interviews that you have with these gentlemen,
Yeah.
I was like, "Oh yes, it's tremendous." So when he answered, "Hello," my mom was just staring at me. And I says, "You know what? I'm done." It's obvious he doesn't want to talk. Mom's like, "Give it one more try, because who knows what he knows." I says, "Okay." So I says, "I've got to come up with something." So I says, "All right, I think I've got it." So I called again, and he answered the same way, "Hello." And I said, LCI-449. And he says, "What about it?" And I said, "My grandpa was on there." He goes, "Well, so was I." I says, "Well, all right, let's talk about it." So we talked for about 45 minutes, and he never talked to me again. But in that 45 minutes, tremendous puzzle pieces were added to the puzzle. Wow. One being that he turned out to be Raphael Johnson, the African-American, the only African-American. I mean, you think about that. The only African-American on a ship of 70 guys. But it turns out Junior Hollowell was Raphael Johnson's ammo loader on his 20 millimeter. And as I was unable to speak with Johnson because he had passed away, I was able to get all of that and preserve some more of that story. So that was.
Did you get to record that phone conversation at all? Or?
That, unfortunately, that phone conversation I wasn't recording at that time. It was shortly thereafter that I was like, I've got to start. I was taking notes, and it was. But so with me contacting all these fellas, I struck a deal with them. If you send me pictures you have of yourself in uniform and the shipmates and crew, what I'll do is I will send you copies of everything that everybody's sent me already. Worked beautifully. So the guys were sending me their pictures, so I'm getting 3 and 4 from them, and they're getting 25, 30, 35 pictures from me in return, pictures they didn't even know existed of the ship. For instance, a picture of the bow of the LCI-449. These are some of the pictures that started coming in. There's a picture of the bow. There's a picture of the pilot house. Picture of the pilot house is very interesting because it was taken while the crew was around the Marshall Islands. You can tell the Marshalls are easily discernible because they're very flat, and whereas in the Marianas there's a lot of mountains and this and that. But this is one of the funny pictures that we get from the crew horsing around, and you can see the officers in the conning tower. And then there is the picture. The next picture is one of my favorites. It's a picture of the crew with what looks to be a barracuda, if I was to guess, probably a barracuda. You see at the bottom left is David Fletcher from North Carolina, who looks to be biting the tail. But sobering is that almost half of the guys in this photo will die at Iwo Jima. And it's, you know what, when I was doing the story and I started getting names for these guys. For instance, the guy first from the left, who's at the top there, he definitely dies, but I was able to find his son. You know, it makes it more real for you. You know, when you're reading a book, a lot of times you hear names and this and that, but when you get a picture of the person, but not only that, you actually connect with their family. It's very, but you know, the story was revealed. You know, the story was being revealed to me. And in this next photograph, you'll see the LCI Group 8. This is one of my favorite photographs because in this picture, in this photograph, you see that the picture is taken from the LCI gunboat 474. And this is the LCI group actually heading into Iwo Jima. And in front of that one is the 438. In front of that one is the 449 with my grandfather aboard. In front of that one is the 441. And then leading the way is the 457. And, you know, within 2 hours of this photograph, the picture that the LCI that the picture is taken from will actually be on the ocean floor. But when I look at that picture and I can see Mount Suribachi in the background, and I know the history of what's about to happen in 2 days when the Marines hit, knowing the history of what happens to the group, it's very powerful. Absolutely. Very powerful. And this next part here, which I'm hoping will work out, this is actually a picture from the Battleship Texas, currently parked near Galveston, from what I understand. And you can see LCI Group 8 now has fanned out and they are heading into the beach. So why was LCI Group 8 there? They were there to protect the underwater demolition teams. From Tarawa, the Marines and the Navy had learned that it was absolutely vital that they get real-time information because the invasion of Tarawa was based on old charts, old sea charts, and it was faulty intel. And they thought there would be plenty of water over the reef. When they got there, there wasn't. And the rest is history. So to combat that, they came up with underwater demolition teams. Today, we call them the Navy SEALs. Back then, they were called UDTs. And at Iwo Jima, they were going to go in 2 days before the invasion, collect samples of soil from the beach, check the grade of the beach. They were checking to see if there were mines, if there were obstacles, which they had found hundreds of in previous missions at Saipan and Guam. And that's what's going on here is that the frogmen are in there, teams UDT, teams 12, 13, 14, and 15. And in this photograph, you can see that LCI Group 8 is going in to provide cover fire. The LCI gunboats are loaded down with rockets. They've got rocket launchers. They've got 40 millimeters. They've got 20 millimeters. But most importantly, they have experience. These guys had been at the Marshalls. They had cut their teeth at Kwajalein and Roy Namur, at Eniwetok, and all through this little small Marshalls campaign there, taking the little atolls. So they had fine-tuned their skill. And then when they went to Saipan, they went to Guam, they were at Tinian. So by the time they get to Iwo Jima, who are we going to get to cover the underwater demolition teams? The call went out. We want LCI Group 8.
I think it's interesting to point out too. You see in the photograph, there's a pall of smoke, and it looks like there may even be some rockets in the air there. You see some of those blips of light in that smoke. So again, this is 2 days before we invaded the island.
That's right. There were no Marines there except for, at this point, there are no Marines there except for Marines that are shipboard, aboard battleships and capital ships, and then Marine observers who were aboard a lot of the landing craft, who were going to then give intel to their units later on, and also Marines who happened to be part of underwater demolition. So yes, this is a very active, this is a photograph taken when the rockets are flying, and you can see there's a splashing in the water from the Japanese are starting to retaliate. And if we can go to the next one, and I'm hoping that this one here, this is the LCIs heading in past the Battleship Nevada. So if the photographer had turned around and snapped a photograph, he would have got my grandpa's gunboat. Oh wow! Because it was all lined up, and they were the next in line. It just so happens that this is the 438, 474, 450, and 473, all of whom would be hit within the next hour. The 473's engine room would be flooded to the ceiling, had to be towed out. The 438 had a giant hole in its bow. The 474 would sink. The 450 was holed and fire belching from its sides. It just went on and on and on. If we can go to the next one, we'll see. And I'm hoping that this right here is just, this is what it's, this is what I'm passionate about, is letting people know about what happened. No one knows that the Navy was there 2 days before, that these guys were putting their lives on the line to try and make sure that the Marines had good intel, that they would get on the beach, they would be successful at getting on the beach. That's why they were there, and you can see the 474 is going down. The next one should be so when the guys are going in, I talked about the 438, the 450, the 474, these other ones, but the 449, which is the one my grandfather was on, when they were going into the beach, they were getting closer, 1,000-yard line, 900-yard line, 800. They're getting closer and closer and closer. William Hildebrand, who's in this photograph right here, he was walking. He was an ammo passer on the bow of 40, and he looked overhead and he says, "Where are all the planes?" Because in all the practices they had done at Tinian, there were aircraft, and so he thought, "Where are the aircraft?" And when he said that, he heard boom, and he looked to the right. And the 441 gunboat just took a round right into the bow, and flames and smoke were coming out of the bow. And he goes, "The 441 just got hit," and then everything goes black for him. Because at that moment, the LCI 449 was hit on the bow by a mortar. A lot of the other gunboats on the left, which historians of Iwo Jima will find very interesting, they were punched with artillery from Suribachi. So those rounds were flat trajectory. So the ships were sinking, but there was very little actual human toll taken on those. But on the other flank, where my grandfather and the 441 and the 457 were, there were a lot of mortars. And so what was happening is, and the reason those ships had higher human toll was that the mortars were coming in and they were landing where the people were, which was topside, manning all the guns and passing ammunition.
It gives you an idea, too, of how close the ships were to the island when they were operating.
They were mortar range close.
Mortar range, yeah.
Mortar range close. There were, afterwards, in particular, 471, Lieutenant J.G. Crandall from the 471 went around and was sweeping up spent rifle rounds, machine gun bullets, not casings, the shrapnel fragments, scooping them up and putting them into a big bag, which he took aboard the command ship and dumped on the desk of the commanders. So the first hit hits the bow, it hits the ammo locker, blows up the ammo, just disintegrates. Huge giant hole in the bow of the ship. The second hit, and that is where that previous photo there is John Overchuck, who's leaning against the bow. Leaning against a broom. The second mortar, once again mortar, came in and hit right on the gun deck And right between the two 40s, where all those guys are crowded with the ammo and manning their positions. John Overchuk vividly describes the scenes there. The third one came in and hit, you see this photograph here of the officers on top of the conning tower. Left to right is Herring, Yarborough, Bedell, and Cooper. Of those, 2 will die. One missing, still hasn't been found. One, the Medal of Honor, and one, the Silver Star. But that one that came in on the conning tower just hit right in the middle of the officers and the observers and the signalmen.
And this is on 449.
This is all 449. Yeah. And as it turned out, you know, somebody had to step up, because Rufus Herring on the left there, he was taken out. And so what happened was the engineering officer turned out to be the only one left on his feet. He was the youngest officer. It was his first mission. He had only been in the Pacific a matter of months, and now he's in command. So he has a ship that's on fire, a ship with 60% casualties, a ship that's listing to port, and they're still within range of the Japanese guns. And you're in command. Anybody would want that job? I don't think so. Yeah. But he did it. And the way that he stepped up is phenomenal. I can say that I'm here today because of his actions. He saved the rest of that crew. Wow. Someone else who stood up was Arthur Lewis. That's Leo Bedell's picture there. If we can go to the next one, you're going to see a picture of Arthur Lewis, the signalman. There were 3 signalmen. He's the only one that was left alive, but he was, as it would turn out, mortally wounded. To signal for help. The mission was over. They had 60% casualties, 21 killed, 22 wounded. To signal for help, all of the signal lights had been destroyed. The semaphore flags were gone. The mast had been blown off, so there was no way to signal with flags. There was no way to blink for help. The antenna went over with the mast, so there was no way to radio. So what they did was Arthur Lewis, though he was mortally wounded, told some fellas to heft him up on their shoulders, and he used bloody rags to semaphore that they needed help. Wow. And they got that help from the USS Terror, who you see here. That was a minesweeper command ship. And you can see that the Terror is helping. Now, the payoff from all of this is that the Japanese revealed their hidden guns in Suribachi. And it was startling to the Americans, because then they realized that our bombardment that we've been doing for months from bombarding from planes hasn't done anything. And they had charts, and they were marking where all the flashes and the gun flashes were coming from. And the next 2 days, the Nevada, the Tennessee, the Texas, point blank range went in there and blew them out of the side of the mountains. Giant artillery pieces were seen tumbling down the side of Suribachi. Those were guns that were, the gunners were so accurate, they were punching holes in these gunboats and where their numbers are. They were punching holes. That's how good they were. But they weren't there when the Marines landed, because they had revealed and actually gone against Kobayashi's orders on not to open fire. So thankfully that happened. The cost was tremendous. And as you can see in this photograph from the 441 gunboat, the cost was high. There were 54 guys killed total, over 200 wounded, and they were just burnt, shrapnel riddled. However, to show honor to that group, they received the President's Unit Citation. Wow. And there were 1 Medal of Honor, 11 Navy Crosses, dozens and dozens of Bronze and Silver Stars, and hundreds of Purple Hearts received by this small, insignificant group that no one knows about, LCI Group 8. And my grandfather was there. It's all told in this story, The Heart of Hell. I approached Pulitzer Prize-winning author Mitch Weiss with my research. I thought it was a great story, but he says it's only going to be good if you have at least 25 interviews. I says, I've got 300. I've got 300. And he says, my goodness, how did you find the time? And where did you get the drive? And I says, well, my mother asked me to find out. So I did it. And this title of the book, The Heart of Hell, comes from, remember Bruce Hallett, who I interviewed and threw up into the sink when I interviewed him. The title of the book comes from a poem he wrote called What Price Glory? And when he was laying against the railing of the ship looking up at the conning tower, he was watching as the crew from the Terror was coming down from the conning tower where the officers and the signalmen were. And they were coming down with his shipmates. Bruce Hallett was laying against the railing, smoldering, huge hole in his hip, burned, and he was looking up at the conning tower, the steps, and he could see them coming down the steps with his shipmates, but his shipmates were in buckets. And that vision of seeing his shipmates and friends in buckets, he wrote that poem that following night aboard the Terror while he was receiving hospital care. And one of the lines says he felt he'd been dropped into the heart of hell. And when we read that poem, we go, there's the title.
Absolutely.
So giving the ultimate goal was Mom wanted me to find out what happened, right?
Yeah.
That was the whole driving force. I want you to find out what happened to Daddy during the war. So I'll never forget, we got Mom to the Tower of America. At the top, there's a restaurant that revolves. We got Mom up there under false pretenses. And when we got her there, our whole family was there. And I stood up and I says, I have an announcement. I says, Mom, just think, the book is coming out now. In a matter of weeks, people all across the country are going to have it. They're going to be able to look at it on March 1st, 2016, but not you. And you can imagine, what do you mean, not me? I says, not you, because you get the first.
Oh, wow.
And the publishers had sent me the first one off the press. And I reached under the table and I handed Mom the book. And I said, here are the answers to that question you asked me 15 years ago. Why does Dad have nightmares? And as you can imagine, it was very emotional. And when she read it in a matter of 2 weeks, and she sent me a 3-page letter talking about how impactful it was and how much she loved the book and how she was so thankful that it answered so many questions. And we would hear from people all over the country that many reviews saying, thank you so much, because now I know what happened to my dad, my brother, my uncle, my grandfather. Yeah, it's just phenomenal.
Mission accomplished. Well done. Well, speaking of questions, if anybody has any questions, if you'd like to use the chat feature right there, we'll be here for the next few minutes with Dennis Blocker. Again, like I say, he's a Pacific War historian, and what a compelling story. This is not the first time I've heard your family story. And of course, I've read this incredible book, and it's just, I think it bodes really well with the mission statement that we have here at the National Museum of the Pacific Wars, inspiring our youth by honoring our heroes. And I think that's exactly what you've done in that 15 years of research and answering these questions, honoring the men that you showed pictures of today.
Well, I can tell you from my own perspective that the book wouldn't be here. The journey would not have started had it not been for this museum and the Admiral Nimitz Foundation, because when I was first starting out, I didn't know where to start. And I just came here because this is the Pacific War Museum. And I knocked on the door and was admitted into Admiral Grosjean's office, who was at the helm during that time. And he surprised me. He brought me in. We sat down, and I told him what I was trying to do. And he put his whole force behind opening doors for me and encouraging me. And this museum and the Admiral Nimitz Foundation is directly responsible for the fuel that emboldened me and gave me strength for those 14 years. It's phenomenal.
Well, I have a question for you. Is there plans going forward? I mean, you've done so much research and you had that personal connection. But do you have any plans going forward to help publish anything else? Because, I mean, like I said, obviously mission accomplished, but this is just one small story in the vast greatest generations. Do you have any plans to go forward?
I through my research, I was, of course, introduced to the LCI Association, and they saw my passion and they made me their Pacific War historian. And I took their index of their archive from 15 pages when I got it to, I grew it to 150 under my leadership. And then we dedicated that to the museum here in Fredericksburg. And so my goal was that the ultimate far-reaching goal was that I wanted to tell the complete story. This is just one LCI, one Group 8, but there were, dozens and dozens and hundreds of ships. So my goal was to tell the story. So as far as looking to the future, I do want to publish a complete history of LCI operations in World War II, covering the Atlantic and the Pacific.
Yeah.
I envision it being maybe a 10-part series of books. Yeah, that's looking forward to the future. That's what I want to do.
Yeah, excellent. That's incredible. So we've got a question here from Steve Dedrow. Might you want to touch on the Howard S. story?
Oh, Howard Schoenleben. When I was speaking with Leo Bedell, the engineering officer, he said that when he was coming around the conning tower and then got that first hit on the bow, that a leg flew from the front of the ship and flew over Leo Bedell's shoulder. And that's when he knew that things were a lot different than he had been told. And they went forward, and he saw his friend, Howard Schoenleben, stumbling around the deck. He was a gunner's mate on the starboard side, 40 millimeter. And Howard's left arm and shoulder was gone. Leo could see in through this chest cavity. He could see Howard's heart was beating, and he knew that he was going to die. But they were close. They had a close friendship. And so Ensign Leo Bedell, put his arm around Schoenleben's waist and walked him toward the rear of the ship, the fantail, where the pharmacist mate, Henry Boykman, had set up a first aid station. When he was laying there in Leo's arms, Leo gave him a couple syrettes of morphine, and Howard looked up at Leo and said, "Howie, Howie, Howie," and then closed his eyes, and he was gone. So when Leo was telling me that story in an interview, I thought that had to mean something. You know, he used his last energy to say, "Howie, Howie, Howie." That was important to him. He knew he was dying. So I started doing research on that. What could that possibly have meant? And I called up several of the fellows who had survived, and I said, "Was Howard Schoenleben married?" And they said, "Yes, he was. As a matter of fact, Dennis, when we left Saipan, we topped off our fuel and ammo at Saipan to head to Iwo. The mail caught up with us, and Howard got a letter in the mail saying, from his wife, saying, 'You have a son. I've named him Howard.'"
Oh, wow.
So Howard was running around the ship waving this letter. "I got a son. I got a son. I got a son." So now I knew what Howie, Howie, Howie meant.
Yeah.
And now I knew that I needed to find Howard Schoenleben Jr. So I did research. He was from Chicago originally. I looked there, nobody. Broadened it to Illinois, no hits. Broadened it to the United States, and one Howard Schoenleben came up in San Diego, California. And the approximate age matched perfectly. So I called, left a message on his phone. "I think my grandfather served with your dad. Please give me a call." He called me back and said, "I don't think my dad served with your grandfather because my dad was killed." And I says, "Was your dad killed February 17th, 1945 at Iwo Jima aboard a LCI 449? He says, "Yes." How did you know that? I says, "What do you know about your dad's death?" He says, "I don't know anything. We just got a letter saying he had been killed and that he was buried at sea per naval tradition. That's all I know." And I said, "I have an amazing story to tell you." And I had the honor of telling him, "Your dad said your name 3 times at Iwo Jima and died."
Wow. That's incredible. Andy Rymel has a great comment here that soldiers such as he do not speak freely of the war. And I think, like we've touched on that before, you know, the greatest generation sometimes was the silent generation. And I'm curious as to when you were meeting these folks and talking on the phone, did you ever kind of haphazardly have a kind of a reunion with the shipmates on 449 that didn't know if the other was still alive?
Andy Rymel, her dad, Chuck Banco, was actually a very good friend of Bruce Hallett, and they were both on the bow 40 millimeter. And when it took that hit on the bow and the ammunition locker, it blew up, they were both burned. Bruce crawled towards the bow and hugged the prow of the ship as the ammunition was blowing up over him. Chuck had been blown backwards and woke up, he was unconscious, dangling down the ladder, and woke up upside down in a world upside down. So they were both wounded and burned, and they didn't realize that the other had survived. And when they were evacuated, they never saw each other again. So they lived their whole lives, decades and decades and decades, 60 years, not realizing the other had survived. And when I was talking to Bruce, he told me about how sad he was that, you know, about his buddy Chuck. And I says, "Banco?" He says, "Yes." I said, "He lives like 70 miles from you."
Oh my goodness.
So to answer, yes, they did in fact reunion, and I got some great pictures of them together, sitting together, enjoying each other's company, big smiles on their faces. But and also in answer to that question and statement from Andy was that they did not speak freely, but for some reason they did to me.
Mm.
I would go back and tell families about things that they had told their father had told me, and they couldn't believe it because they had never, for instance, the story of the leg flying over Bedell's shoulder. When I spoke to his sons, Terry, he had no idea that it had even happened.
Probably
there was something about me, these guys, they felt comfortable. They could see my heart.
Yeah.
And they knew I was serious, and they told me.
Yeah. I think sometimes veterans do hold a lot of that in, especially from their families, not wanting to, put the family in any kind of, oh boy, I didn't realize you had to go through that, or look at them any differently. But I think definitely for you, that I think they saw this as a way to get this story out that really needed to be told, and was told beautifully. So absolutely. So folks, I think for now we don't have any fresh questions coming in, but I do want to remind everybody. Of course, we want everybody, like Dennis said, the story started here at the National Museum of the Pacific War. And we want everybody, of course, to come visit us here. Unfortunately, indefinitely, the museum, the campus here is closed. However, we will still be engaging and educating you. Please make sure, like as I mentioned before, this is the second of 6 webinars we'll be doing throughout the year. It's the anniversary, the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. And we are looking forward to many more videos and virtual educational opportunities that we'll be offering here. So make sure you stay visiting our website, staying in touch on our YouTube page, as there's a lot more stories like Dennis Blocker's grandfather that we're going to be diving into and bringing to you as much as we can. So with that, I thank you for joining us.
No, thank you so much for having
we
me.
want everybody to, how can they get this book? And like I said, the museum store is closed right now, so we're going to offer this online.
Yep.
Sales will not stop.
Yeah,
so be looking here in a minute for the website to visit our museum store, get The Heart of Hell, read it, and understand what was done for us so long ago. So thanks again for joining us. Again, my name is Jeff Copsetta, and we'll see you next time.